this clash didn't happen in a vacuum. Australians are already under pressure. Rents are up, power bills are up, groceries cost more every week. So when people heard that taxpayer-funded payments might be flowing in ways they find morally troubling, frustration boiled over. Not because of the dollar amount, but because of what it symbolised, a growing sense that decisions are being made far away from everyday experience. For families in regional and rural areas where maternity services are already stretched, the debate felt especially personal. Healthcare is fragile, trust matters, and when that trust cracks, it spreads fast. If you're feeling squeezed right now, say whether you're watching from a city or regional area. The reactions haven't been the same everywhere. Because once this nerve was hit, everyone had something to say, and suddenly the conversation got a lot bigger. Veterans groups weighed in, faith communities issued statements, women's organisations split internally. Medical professionals tried to slow the conversation down, warning against oversimplifying complex realities. Each group looked at the same policy through a different lens and came away with a completely different conclusion. Some saw a necessary safety net, others saw a moral blind spot. And the more voices joined in, the harder it became for the government to keep this framed as a routine administrative matter, because it clearly wasn't. The explanation Labor hoped would calm things down didn't land the way they expected, and that's when the government drew a clear line.
Katy Gallagher refused to concede any wrongdoing. Payments, she said, are made lawfully, according to existing legislation, with medical certification. No exceptions, no apologies. The government supports state and territory laws governing reproductive health and sees no basis for change without broader legal reform. Legally sound, politically risky, because even some Labor supporters quietly admitted the optics were troubling. When people start saying it might be legal but it doesn't feel right, that's when pressure builds, and it did. Fast. Because now this wasn't just about Hanson versus Gallagher, it was about whether the government was listening, and that question triggered the next phase of fallout. By the next morning, the lines were drawn. Coalition figures accused Labor of hiding behind process while ignoring a serious ethical concern. They argued this wasn't about attacking reproductive law, it was about honesty and clarity in how taxpayer money is used. Crossbench senators demanded answers, not speeches, not talking points, actual clarification. Green senators pushed back hard. They warned the debate was sliding into fear-based rhetoric and accused Hanson of dragging deeply personal medical decisions into political theatre. And that's when it became obvious. This wasn't one argument anymore. It was several happening at once. Money, morality, trust, autonomy. If you've ever watched politics and felt like everyone's talking past each other, this was a textbook example. Drop a comment with one word that best describes this moment in Parliament. Just one word. Because while the Senate argued, others were quietly backing away. State premiers and health ministers moved quickly. They reminded reporters that abortion laws are state-based, that the Commonwealth doesn't regulate medical procedures, that this wasn't their jurisdiction. Technically true, emotionally unsatisfying. To everyday Australians, it sounded like buck-passing. Federal money was at the centre of the controversy, but no one wanted ownership of the consequences. And that contradiction, federal payments tied to state-regulated outcomes, became impossible to ignore. It raised an uncomfortable question. If responsibility is shared, then why does accountability feel so scattered? That question didn't stay local for long. Commentators overseas started paying attention. Countries with similar welfare systems pointed to Australia as a case study in what happens when legal definitions collide with public expectations. Some praised the robustness of parliamentary scrutiny. Others warned that the debate risked flattening complex medical realities into political soundbites. Either way, the story travelled. Quietly, then quickly. And when your domestic policy becomes international commentary, pressure at home intensifies. Because now this wasn't just about fixing a loophole, it was about reputation. Talkback radio lit up. Hosts asked the question politicians kept dodging. Will the rules be reviewed, yes or no? Editorials questioned whether definitions written decades ago still reflect community standards. Even supporters of the government admitted privately that the explanation wasn't cutting through. When your allies start saying, this needs to be handled better, that's a warning sign. Momentum was shifting, and by yesterday afternoon, the Senate had reached a breaking point. The Senate president intervened again. Comments were ruled unparliamentary. A withdrawal was ordered. For a moment, calm returned, but only on the surface, because the damage wasn't procedural, it was reputational. The question had been asked, the answer, or lack of one, was now on the public record. Australians were left staring at an uncomfortable truth. Laws designed for efficiency don't always align with deeply held moral beliefs, and once people notice that gap, they don't unsee it. Strip away the shouting. Strip away the politics, and what's left is something much bigger than one payment. This is about how a modern democracy handles the collision between law, ethics, autonomy, and accountability, about whether governments should proactively close loopholes that offend a significant portion of the community, even when those loopholes are technically lawful, about trust, if citizens believe their leaders will confront uncomfortable questions or deflect them with procedure until the outrage fades. If this debate made you pause and rethink how these systems work, you're exactly who this conversation is really about. As the week draws to a close, the government insists nothing improper has occurred. Hanson insists the law itself is the problem, and in between are millions of Australians trying to make sense of a debate that touches on life, loss, choice, and money, all at once. So the questions remain. Should the rules be changed? Should intent matter? Should Parliament revisit definitions most people never knew existed? Or is this another case of politics exploiting a painful issue for advantage? If you've watched this far, tell me what you think. Should the loophole be closed, clarified, or left alone? Your answer matters more than any talking point. This wasn't just a clash in the Senate, it was a mirror held up to how our systems really work and where they fall short. The government says the system is lawful, Hanson says the system is wrong, and Australians are left deciding who they trust. This debate will continue, in Parliament, on air, online, around dinner tables, and the next chapter is coming. If you want to stay ahead of it, subscribe now, because this story isn't finished, and neither is the fallout. Share this with someone who needs to see it, and I'll see you in the next one. Australians were told this payment was about compassion, about loss, about families facing the unthinkable. But one question in the Senate cracked that story wide open. Not during a fiery speech, not during some dramatic vote, but after question time, when no one was really paying attention. And when the minister answered, the room shifted. If you care about where your tax dollars actually go, not the spin, not the slogans, stay with me, because this gets uncomfortable fast. And before we go any further, take a second to subscribe. Most people watching right now aren't subscribed, and this channel is where we break down the stories politicians hope you scroll past.
My question is to the Minister for Women and Government Services, Minister Gallagher. In a letter from Services Australia, dated July 2nd, 2025, it confirms that the stillborn baby payment of $4,326.57 is available in cases of intentional abortion where a pregnancy has reached 20 weeks or the child weighs 400 grams. While One Nation supports the stillborn baby payment for legitimate and heartbreaking cases, Minister, why is this payment being made to women who deliberately abort a baby?
I know that there is a number of steps that are taken before a family that's been affected by stillbirth are eligible for that payment. It includes a number of different pieces of documentation, but that payment, supported by that appropriate documentation, will be paid in those circumstances. It includes, in often quite traumatic circumstances, as you can imagine, evidence of the stillbirth from people who were attending the birth. That is required before the payments are made, associated with other documentation that's required by Services Australia to make that payment provided. We accept that in the case of stillbirth, it is a very traumatic situation for anyone who is involved in that. And I think even applying for that payment at times can be quite traumatic, and so we've looked at ways to make sure that that is as seamless as possible. But like every other payment that's required and provided by Services Australia, those payments are made in accordance with the law and in accordance with guidance and evidence that those payments are appropriate. It's that for whether it's job seeker, whether it's single parenting payment, whether it's PPL, and in the case of the loss of a baby through pregnancy loss, those payments will be made when that is supported by evidence that's required by Services Australia.
Question time had wrapped up. Most senators were already half focused on their next meeting, their phones or the headlines waiting outside. That's usually how it goes. Then Pauline Hanson stood up. No theatrics, no long preamble, just a direct question that landed like a weight dropping onto the chamber floor. She asked why a government payment designed to support families devastated by stillbirth was also being paid out in cases where a pregnancy ended intentionally late in gestation. For a split second, the room went still. This wasn't a question about budgets or party politics. It wasn't even framed as an ideological attack. It was a question about intent, and you could feel it. Heads lifting, papers pausing mid-turn, senators suddenly listening again. If you're watching this from Australia, pause for a second and think about that, because most Australians had no idea this question even existed. Drop a comment saying where you're watching from, city, regional or remote, because this debate cuts very differently depending on where you live. But the real shock wasn't the question itself. It was what Hanson had in her hand when she asked it. And that's where things really began to unravel. Hanson wasn't speculating. She wasn't relying on rumour or hearsay. She cited official correspondence from Services Australia, a letter dated earlier this month. Dry, administrative, the kind of document most people never read and never expect to become political dynamite. The letter laid out eligibility for the stillborn baby payment, not based on how the pregnancy ended, but on gestation length and birth weight, clinical thresholds, numbers on a page. No distinction between tragedy and decision, no reference to intent, just criteria. That's when the first "wait, what?" moment rippled through the chamber, because suddenly the payment Australians believed existed solely to support families struck by unavoidable loss appeared to apply far more broadly than anyone had assumed. You could almost hear the question forming in people's minds. If the system doesn't ask why, then what exactly is it paying for? The language was cold, procedural, designed for efficiency, not moral clarity. And that contrast between paperwork and human reality is what made this so volatile. The camera cut to the minister's table, Katy Gallagher, and in that moment she knew every word mattered. If this is already making you uneasy, you're not alone. Let me know in the comments with a single word that captures how this feels right now. Because the answer that followed didn't calm the room, it did the opposite.
I answered the question, which was, Why is it made to women who deliberately abort a baby? Minister, this policy risks creating a financial incentive for late-term abortion where Australian women can terminate a pregnancy up to the day before birth. They can terminate a pregnancy up to the day before birth, allowing women to receive a lump sum payment and access to paid parental leave of up to $22,754. Why is the Albanese government funding the murder of healthy babies, some left to die in a kidney dish for up to 5 hours?
Thank you, Senator Hanson. The time for asking the question has expired. Minister Gallagher.
Well, the answer to that question is the same as to my earlier question. There are laws in this country around termination of pregnancy. They are laws that are regulated by the states and territories, and I support those laws. One of the reasons I got into politics was to ensure that women had the right to make choices about their own reproductive health. I accept that some people disagree with my views on that and with laws in states and territories that provide the regulatory arrangements around that. Now, in relation to the stillborn baby payment, as I said, and as it relates to other payments, including PPL, evidence is required, documentation is required before those payments are made. In relation to the stillborn baby payment, that includes certification from someone attending the birth, a health professional attending the birth, that the birth was of a stillborn child. That is the documentation that's made or required in order to receive that payment.
Minister, when you talk about stillborn births, let me inform the people, the public of this nation, that they are actually injecting a needle into the heart of the baby that before it's born, therefore it is born stillborn. Minister, will you and the Albanese Government work with One Nation to close this appalling loophole and ensure these taxpayer-funded payments are reserved for genuine cases of stillbirth, not for barbaric late-term abortions carried out by choice?
Thank you, Senator Hanson. Minister Gallagher.
Thank you. Well, my answer to this is as it was to the earlier two questions. I have not seen any, and I have not had raised with me outside of this chamber right now the concerns that Senator Hanson raises with me. But in order for a stillborn baby payment to be paid, what is required is a paper-based form from the hospital containing a doctor and midwife's declaration that it is used as a verification of the stillbirth. That is what is required to get that payment.
Minister Gallagher can't even define the term stillborn. The government conflates a stillborn baby with an aborted baby. I'm confident a lot of Australians understand there is an obvious difference. A stillborn baby is a baby that dies in the womb, the implication clearly being it is not intended for the baby to die. An aborted baby, on the other hand, is a baby whose survival was not intended in the termination of a pregnancy, but according to the government. The government's definition of a stillborn baby under taxation law of all things is in the letter in which I referred in my question. A child who weighs at least 400 grams at delivery or whose period of gestation was at least 20 weeks and who has not breathed since delivery and whose heart has not beaten since delivery. And it's based on this definition that women seeking abortions are eligible for a taxpayer-funded stillborn baby payment of $4,326. That is one hell of a loophole, which I'm confident is offensive to many Australians who don't approve of late-term abortion. What we know is that these babies are being murdered in the womb with a lethal injection and then being delivered as stillborn, so technically that makes these women eligible for stillborn baby payments and even maternity leave. There is an immediate need to close this loophole and tighten the definition in the new taxation system, Family Assistance Act of 1999, to ensure women who have abortions are not eligible for a stillborn baby payment. Australia should not, in any way, shape or form, be financially incentivising abortions via payments intended for parents of stillborn babies. During my question, I heard roar from the Greens. Of course, they're all for murdering of babies. This is happening that they can actually have an abortion right up the day before actual birth of that child, and they inject the child, it's still in the womb, with a needle into the heart, which kills the baby. And some are born and left in kidney trays for 5 hours to die with no help. Let them be adopted out. Disgusting. Shame on the government.
Senator Hanson, to be honest, was waiting for someone to stand, but I will ask you to withdraw the comment regarding the Greens' approach to I don't want to repeat the phrase, but I think you should withdraw that phrase.
I will withdraw that comment. They're precious.
Senator Hanson, please withdraw unreservedly.
I will withdraw unreservedly.
Thank you.
This week,
Katy Gallagher didn't rush her answer. She chose her words carefully, almost too carefully. She spoke about documentation, medical certification, the trauma experienced by families who suffer pregnancy loss. Everything she said was technically correct. The payment, she explained, is administered by Services Australia based on existing law. Public servants don't make moral judgments. They apply criteria. Doctors certify. The system processes. On paper, it sounded responsible, measured, professional. But inside the chamber, the tension didn't ease, because Hanson wasn't asking how the system works. She was asking what the system allows. And that gap between process and principle hung in the air. For Australians watching at home, especially families already stretched thin, the message landed awkwardly. If you're struggling to afford rent, childcare or groceries, hearing a minister default to bureaucratic language doesn't feel reassuring. It feels distant. Gallagher kept returning to the same point. The law is clear, the rules are followed, and the payment exists to support families through trauma. But the more she leaned on procedure, the sharper the unasked question became. If the law doesn't distinguish between loss and choice, should it? If you've ever listened to a politician answer a question without really answering it, you know the feeling. Drop a comment if this sounds familiar to you. Because Hanson wasn't done, not even close. Hanson cut back in. This wasn't about forms or certificates, she said. It was about intent, about whether a payment created for grief was being used in situations where the outcome wasn't accidental, unexpected, or unavoidable. She argued the law itself contains a loophole, one so wide most Australians never realised it was there. And here's where the debate shifted. This stopped being left versus right. It stopped being about abortion laws specifically. It became about trust. When governments design payments, people assume the definitions reflect community standards, that there's some shared understanding baked into the rules. Hanson's claim was simple, and that's why it hit hard. That understanding no longer exists. Short sentences started flying across the chamber, interruptions, raised voices. The contrast was stark. On one side, legal frameworks, state-based regulation, administrative neutrality. On the other, moral instinct and public expectation. If you're watching this thinking, how did no one notice this earlier, you're asking the same question millions of Australians started asking that afternoon, and the room was about to lose control. Interjections came from multiple directions. The Senate President stepped in, then stepped in again. Order was called, but calm didn't return. You could feel the frustration spilling out, not just from Hanson, but from senators who realised this exchange wasn't staying inside Parliament House. This was going to follow them home. Voices overlapped, points of order were raised, withdrawals demanded. For viewers at home, this wasn't just noise, it was a visible sign of something deeper, a system struggling to talk about an issue that cuts straight through politics and into personal values. If you've ever watched Parliament and thought, this place feels completely disconnected from real life, you're not imagining it.
React below if that thought crossed your mind during this exchange, because while the chamber tried to regain control, the real explosion was already happening elsewhere, outside, online, and it moved fast. Within hours, clips of the exchange were everywhere. Short snippets, out-of-context quotes, headlines sharpened for maximum impact. Some Australians were stunned. They genuinely had no idea the payment rules worked this way. Others accused Hanson of misrepresenting the policy and weaponising one of the most sensitive topics in public life. Two camps formed almost instantly. One side saying, "This feels wrong even if it's legal." The other saying, "This is fear-driven outrage." And social media did what it always does in moments like this. It poured fuel on the fire. If you've seen the clips, you already know how quickly nuance disappears once a debate goes viral. Comment if this is the first time you're hearing about it. You're far from alone. But what made this blow up wasn't just the content, it was the timing, and that's the part that turned this into a national flashpoint.